Hello, everyone, and welcome to the sixth term of No World series. I think we can get started. Tonight's event is on the subject of reflection of culture in Chinese intellectual history. We are hosting two eminent professors as our lecturers, Professor Peter Ball and Professor Hoseini Moghadam. I would like to appreciate both our guests for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Leila Khadem, Post-Doctoral Researcher at the University of Russian Foreign Ministry, and tonight I'm serving as the moderator. I would like to extend a warm welcome both to the audience and to our dear lecturers, Professor Peter Ball and Professor Hoseini. Before we get started, I wanted to take some minutes of you to introduce our lecturers. Professor Peter Ball, a name absolutely known amongst sinologists, so well known that needs no introduction, with a reputation genuinely international. The topic of tonight's talk is particularly appropriate one to Professor Peter Ball, who is accurately defined by his colleagues as rock star of Chinese history. Charles Carswell, Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilization at Harvard. Professor Ball's luminous publications in the area of Chinese intellectual and cultural history and civilization expands through 7th to 17th century. Professor Ball's research is centered on the history of China's cultural elites at the national and local levels. He is the author of This Culture of Ours, Intellectual Transitions in Tang and Song China, Neo-Confucianism in History and Localizing Learning, The Literati Enterprise in Weizhou, 1800 to 1600, co-author of Song Dynasty Uses of the I Ching, co-editor of Ways with World, and various journal articles in Chinese, Japanese, and English. He led Harvard University's wide effort to establish support for geospatial analysis and teaching and research. In 2005, he was named the first director of the Center for Geographic Analysis. This second title as the founding director of the Harvard Center for Geographic Analysis testifies both to the breadth of his scholarly interests and to the depth of his contributions to the historical profession, extending far beyond to the study of Chinese history alone, among other things, by expanding the ways we think about the spatial dimensions of historical study. Our second lecturer, Dr. Hoseini Moghadam, faculty member of Department of Futurology at the Institute of Cultural and Social Studies, member of the Science and Technology Convergence, director of Crisis Management and Futurology Research Group, vice president of Futurology Research Center at Tehran University, research head of Scientific and International Cooperation Office at International University of Imam Khomeini, superintendent of the Persian Language Education Center, member of Council of Futurology Research Institute, general manager of Provincial Elite Foundation Planning. His fields of research interests include futurology of science, technology and higher education, artificial intelligence and the future of science and technology developments in the world and Iran, globalization and internationalization of higher education, policy making of science, technology, and innovation, and science diplomacy. Our dear lecturers, before we get started, in case you're interested, please greet with our audience and together.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you, and greetings to Professor Moghadam.
And it is a great chance for me to be in this event. Thank you, Ms. Khadem.
Thank you. I myself was so excited for tonight's event, and I'm sure it will be one of the remarkable ones. For our first question, Professor Peter Ball, today it's acknowledged that China has become a major scientific technological power and thereby an economic superpower. In your opinion, what are the intellectual and cultural discourses behind China's rise? How do they overlap or differ from modern Western cultural and intellectual discourse? Please.
Thank you very much. This is a very interesting question. and a very difficult one to answer because the scientific and technological establishment of China today really represents a rupture with Chinese tradition. It's derived almost entirely from developments of science and technology in the West, coming to China from Europe, from England, from the United States, and later Japan. And I would say that, generally speaking, the people in China who work on science and technology, who have that as their field, not in the study of the history of science or history of technology, but people who work on science and technology today, probably know very, very little about pre-modern traditions of science and technology in China. So in that sense, it would seem to me that it's quite discontinuous, and this represents a rupture in Chinese intellectual traditions. However, if we look at this in a broader perspective and say, why was it possible for China so quickly to develop a leadership position in science and technology? Then there are two answers. One is a tremendous government investment. The amount of money that China today is putting into life sciences is probably greater than what we see in the United States today. And certainly many young Chinese scholars who do their doctorates, their PhDs in the United States and in Europe return to China in the life sciences field because the funding is so strong in China. So that's one answer to the question of why this developed, which is basically a government commitment. And so one could argue that the idea of a government making a national commitment and funding it has a strong tradition, that China traditionally has assumed that government should lead, even when in fact it didn't. The second answer, which I think bears strongly on tradition, and it helps explain why China could so quickly develop into a leadership position in science and technology, is that China has had a very strong tradition of education and tremendous emphasis on education as necessary for membership in the national elite. So in contrast to Europe, and to some extent, I think, in contrast to the United States, the road to political power did not go via nobility and birth, at least for the last 1,000 years of Chinese history, and did not go via money and wealth, but went via education. So why was it that China has had such a strong emphasis on education? And the answer to that really goes back 1,000 years to the decision to emphasize the civil service examination system as the way of entering government. And that, I think, created a national culture in which education was seen as one of the most important ways of getting ahead. So that's sort of a general two-part answer to your question of why it is that China today can play a leading role in science and technology.
Thank you so much for this concise and at the same time informative answer. China's tradition, of course, plays a role in leading the country, although its scientific and technological way is influenced by Western models. Thank you. Dr. Hosseini, can you hear me, Dr. Hosseini?
Yeah, I can hear you, yeah.
Undeniably, China is one of the oldest and at the same time one of the most magnificent civilizations. Are there any features unique to China to Chinese science and technology that distinguishes from Western flow of science and technology?
First of all, I would like to mention that our invited speakers, Professor Peter Bull, is an esteemed figure in sinology. While I'm not a Chinese scholar, actually, as you mentioned, my expertise is on futures studies. But in my expertise, through the works which I have been engaged with them, focusing on the role and importance of China in shaping the future event and trend in the global atmosphere can be considered as a mega trend. So in a world which characterized by constant change, China is one of the most important driving forces. In my perspective, there are some noteworthy messages which we can learn from science and technology development in China. I would like to first of all focus on future orientation thinking in China. Actually, in the aftermath of communist revolution in China, a new trend emerged in which dreaming about future became a significant aspect of intellectual and revolutionary discourse in China. This trend was marked by concerted efforts at Chinese leaders and intellectuals to gain mutual understanding and knowledge about the future and how to achieve a desirable and preferable future. This national consensus was a key factor in Chinese success in achieving remarkable progress in science and technology. As Zhu Tianyong mentioned, Chinese have struggled for 2 centuries to realize the China dream of modernization. In the first century, in order to create proper political and social environment for industrialization and modernization, the Chinese strove for national independence and liberation of their own people. In the second century, the Chinese strove for national prosperity and happiness into people's life. Realism is another message that we can learn from the China experience in science and technology development. Realism is focused on concrete matters in advancing goals of science and technology. This approach has deep root in Chinese culture, as noted by famous scholar Yutang Ling, who observed that being a realist is inherent in Chinese way of thinking. This practical rationality is based on focus on objective reality rather than supernatural or religious or metaphysical belief. In this intellectual tradition, abstract scientific outputs are viewed with suspicion. And there is a proverb which states that developing pure science without considering its social efficiency is akin to killing dragon. The other message which I want to focus is practice-oriented approach to science, benefiting from science and technology for development of socialism, prosperity, and strength in China. This approach being influenced by view of people like Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and Deng Xiaoping. All of them looking at science as a tool to meet needs of society and nations. Some things that has no practical application is not considered very scientific in this approach. This is to somehow, despite the fact that in intellectual tradition of West, science has its own independence status, and scientific progress does not necessarily mean to development of technology or practical application. This is why some critics believe that this action-oriented thinking has caused basic science, humanities, and social science not to develop in China. One critic asserted that Chinese were in need of power rather than science, as it is through power that China could be saved, become a prosperous nation. In the intellectual tradition of West, distinction between free science and productive science has been acknowledged, and both forms of this scientific inquiry have been respected. But in China, we see that productive science has been given more emphasis. In one of his articles, Mao Zedong highlighted the importance of action over theoretical knowledge. He said that knowledge that understands the laws of the world should be used to change the world. While this approach has led to significant achievement in science and technology in China, simultaneously it raised some question about independence of scientific research from political and societal demands. The other message which I want to talk about is China Pass. Zhu Li discussed the idea of China Pass, which refers to a unique development model that China has pursued from 1970s till now. This model emphasizes on economic growth and modernization while maintaining a strong state control and a focus on social stability. Zhu argued that China Pass has been successful in lifting millions of people out of poverty and transforming China into a major economic power. Another message that sets China apart is its emphasis on nationalism. By leveraging science and technology policy, China aims to reinforce its national cultural identity and gain independence in its action on global stage. As Xi Jinping has noted, Chinese institutions should avoid copying from foreign models and focus instead on preserving Chinese essence while applying Western knowledge. The emphasizing of achieving science and technology self-reliance or indigenous innovation strategy has been one of the notable outcomes of Chinese nationalism in science and technology development. This strategy represents China's ambition to develop a robust domestic scientific and technology base, minimize dependence on foreign technology, strengthen national security, and securing its position as a leading global power. China government has launched several initiatives to support this strategy, including Made in China 2025 plan, which aims to upgrade the country's manufacturing capabilities through advanced technology, and China's Standard 2035 plan, which seeks to establish China as a global leader in setting technical standards for emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence. And the final message which I have learned from China experience in science and technology development is international cooperation. And this is a unique message of China. I mean, while China seeks to achieve self-reliance in science and technology, it also recognizes the importance of collaboration with other countries and regions. China has established partnership with different countries and organizations around the world to share knowledge, developing research, educational program, joint venture capital in some startups, technological startup, and promote exchange of researchers and students. To me, these messages are good inspirations for developing countries such as Iran. Thank you. Ms. Khadem, we can't hear you.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Sorry. Professor Peter Ball, in case you have any ideas on the words of Dr. Hosseini.
I do.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So obviously, the professor's knowledge is much more about recent times, the contemporary world, than mine. But he makes, I think, a very important point. His first point, which is that future-oriented thinking. And I think he's quite right that really this notion of thinking about the future comes to China strongly out of Marxism, right? So that if we look at the Chinese past and say, is there a sense of a future orientation that the future world can be different and better, then actually that's something that's absent, right? Traditionally in China, the ideal world was in antiquity. Right? It was the distant past where you had a socially integrated order, where all people did well, where everyone had a role to play. And that was a better world than the present. But there wasn't a sense that there was a future that would be different. That very much comes out of Marxism, but Marxism, of course, gets it from Christianity. So in that sense, it's really rooted deeply in Mediterranean civilization. The second point he makes, I think, about realism and the focus on the concrete leads, of course, to a notion of being a more practice-oriented approach to science. And that, as he points out, that's also in the Marxist tradition. Certainly, one of the slogans that informs contemporary Chinese intellectual life is to seek truth from facts, right? Which is, of course, an alternative to seeking truth from ideology. Right? So that, I think, is that notion of realism and practice-oriented approach is very true. Is that entirely traditional? Not really. I think there is a strong practical tradition in China, but there's also, in the past, a strong ideological and theoretical tradition, particularly bound up with notions of morality. Right? That morality is something that, in traditional ideas, is part of human nature, inheres in the universe itself. And that moves, of course, away from being, I think, totally practically oriented. But clearly, I think the 21st century in China, this sort of realistic, practical oriented approach is very strong. And China, the China path of economic and social stability, economic growth and social stability, is very much the current point of view. Now, at the same time, it has to be admitted that one of the reasons why the social sciences and humanities is perhaps weaker than it might be is precisely because threats to the theoretical and ideological supremacy of the Communist Party and the Chinese regime, right, would come from social sciences and humanities, not from science. And in that sense, I think that we need to recognize that the leadership of China, the political leadership of China, is based on ideology. Right? And that ideology, this notion of socialism with Chinese characteristics, right, actually raises a very important question, which is, to what extent is the Chinese model truly universal if China's path is a path that is defined by socialism with Chinese characteristics? But largely, I find myself in agreement with Professor Hosseini's general comments on China today.
Ms. Khadem, if you can hear me, you should unmute your microphone.
Oh, yes. Every time I forget about it. Thank you for reminding me. Thank you, Peter Ball, for your complimentary words on Dr. Hosseini's words. We can move to another question from Professor Ball. Today, China expanding its markets almost everywhere in the world has hit the global market. Do you think if China aims at cultural and ideological domination of the world along with its economic lead, are there any cases indicating China's attempts for cultural dominance?
Okay. So the answer to that is yes and no, which is the answer to all historical questions, I think. Yes and no. Let's begin with an example of the yes part. As Dr. Hosseini will remember, under Mao Zedong, right, beginning in the late 1950s, there is a split that develops between China and Russia, China and the Soviet Union. And eventually, in the 1960s, during the Cultural Revolution, China claims that Mao Zedong thought is the only true Marxist and communist thought in the world. And Mao Zedong starts to make the claim, as you can see through the propaganda posters of that time, for example, that China is the true leader, the only leader of revolutionary peoples in the world. Right? At that point, China's claim is we have a universal model, right? A model that everyone must follow. And in fact, in many countries in Europe, the United States, in Japan, communist parties split into the pro-Soviet and then the pro-Maoist parties. So that is a moment when China claims that it should dominate because Mao Zedong's thought is the only true universal revolutionary thought. But what's China's view today? When China says that it follows a path of socialism with Chinese characteristics, if those characteristics are Chinese, can other countries follow it? Or in fact, is the collaboration with other countries going to be based not on ideology, but on more practical things like economic development, such as the Belt and Road Initiative? Right? Now, that's the yes part. Let me give an example. Oh, yes, and a bit of no part, too. Let me go back in history and ask another question. Did China in the past provide a model for other countries? And there the answer is yes. But did it try to dominate other countries? The answer is not necessarily. And the Vietnamese, of course, would have a very different answer. Even today, the Vietnamese continue to view China as the major threat to their independence and argue that it has always been a threat to their independence. And they're, by and large, they're right that China has been. I remember China most recently invaded Vietnam in the 1970s, but it had invaded Vietnam repeatedly over the course of its history. But it rarely, at one point it tried to invade Korea, but that stopped after the Tang Dynasty, after the 7th century. It no longer tried to invade Korea. It's never invaded Japan. However, it has invaded to the north and to the west. Just as the Mongols and Manchus invaded China from the north, so has China pushed its territory at various points out into the north. And at various points in history, in the Han Dynasty, the 1st century, 2nd century BCE, in the Tang Dynasty, in the 7th century into the 8th century, in the Yuan Dynasty of the Mongols, and in the Manchu Dynasty, China conquered lands in present-day Xinjiang and going out, extending its territory into the Muslim lands of Dzungaria in Xinjiang. Right? So in that sense, in the border areas of China, China has at various points tried to be a real power and being willing to invade other countries or other peoples. It didn't necessarily regard them as countries. Now, but let's look at a more positive point of view. Did China provide a model? And there, it did clearly provide a model, both for Vietnam. Right? If you go to Vietnam today, you'll find that many things in Vietnam are based on Chinese models, going back in history. For Korea, for Japan, right? China was the richest, largest market in the world in the past. The largest country, right? With a centralized bureaucratic system. And as such, it presented itself and saw itself as the most modern country in the world. And so in that sense, if we go back to the Tang Dynasty, the Sung Dynasty, even the Ming Dynasty, right? Other countries in East Asia looked to China for models. It wasn't that China was trying to push its models on others. Others looked at China and said, you have a model of what it means to be a modern country. Remember that during the Tang Dynasty in the 6th, or in the 7th, 8th, 9th century, right, Japan would send embassies to China, right, with people to study how Chinese did things, to study its laws, to learn its texts, its sacred books, its languages, to study its Buddhism. Right? So in that sense, China, by being a strong, rich, well-educated, well-governed country, provided models for others, not because it insisted others had to adopt its model, it didn't, but others wanted to learn from China. So the question we could ask, and I would ask of Dr. Hosseini as a futurologist, right, is this what China will be in the future? Not that it insists that others adopt its way of government, but others look to China and say, there is a model for us.
Peter, you can call me Mohammad if it doesn't matter to you.
Okay.
Yeah. I want to actually answer to this question that China is internationalizing its value and cultures around the globe. And there is, based on Adam Smith's supply and demand laws, there is a freedom for every country and every agent in the world to participate in this market. So the dominance idea, which some believe that China is going to dominance its culture and values around the world, I think no, it can be understandable because of the freedom which is actually a law of this atmosphere. But we can explain this achievement for China as a soft power based on Joseph Nye definition of soft power. You can see that alongside the China, there are a lot of opportunity for different countries such as India, such as actually Thailand and the other countries to globalize their values, their customs, and their culture and around the world. So I think a kind of a conspiracy theory is behind the question that Ms. Khadem asked you. This is my point of view in this regard, actually.
Thank you both, professors. Dr. Hosseini, do you believe that China has been successful in exercising its soft power? I mean, spreading its cultural values and norms around the world? Maybe in the future. Do you believe in it?
Yeah, I believe it because, you know, even Iran civilization can share a lot of values and cultural values with the other countries around the world. But in terms of soft power, yes, we can see the intentionality of the Chinese government behind this process too. I mean that if you look at the expanding of Confucius Institute and Confucius classroom around the world, you see that there is a huge investment of China government to expand this process. I mean that to its soft power. For example, based on the statistic which are available from 2021, there is more than 550 Confucius Institute and about 1,200 Confucius classroom room around the world in more than 162 countries. So it is a strong signal, an indicator that yes, China succeed to expand its rich cultural heritage and rich cultural value around the world. And we know that it can facilitate the harmony between China and the other countries, this kind of soft power, and facilitate expanding cultural, economic, and political influence of China around the world. To me, yes, China could use actually its cultural heritage to expand its soft power.
Professor Pitchable, to this definite answer of yes, exclusively yes, do you have any more words to add or not?
Yeah, well, so if we look at the Confucius Institute and ask what is the culture that it is offering, right? It's by and large a culture of language teaching. And this is important. You know, today, and if we go to a country like Korea, today probably as many students study Chinese as study English. Right? So will Chinese become a major international language? Well, let me ask the question to Mohammed. How many people in Iran study Chinese language?
Peter, unfortunately, I haven't have exact statistic, but I know that in some university in Iran, for example, Shahid Beshi University, Allama Tabatabai University, they have course on learning Chinese. But there is a great motivation between young people, young generation in Iran to learn Chinese because they know that if they want to have a better future, if they want to have a better life in future, they should know Mandarin, because Mandarin will be then a global or world language of the future.
Yeah. I think that's right, that Chinese will be one of the languages of the future, right? And I would hope that we would think of it in terms of a world with major languages, right? That are lingua francas and not just one like English. But let me change the focus a little bit and say, what is the Chinese view of the world outside of China? Right? Do they see the world outside of China as being important in more than economic ways to China's own development? So, Mohammed, you've emphasized the way in which China can be important to the development of other countries. What does China think now of the importance of other countries to its development? Because all would agree that for the last, well, since the 19th century, that foreign countries have been essential to China's development. And foreign countries, the world outside of China, has provided the models for Chinese development, different kinds of models. Capitalist, socialist, communist, fascist, all the isms of the world outside of China have been tried out in China, right? But there's also been a Chinese ambivalence about the world outside. Right? An ambivalence that would exist in the past. Sometimes the government tried to close the country to foreign influence, to foreign trade. Sometimes it was open to it. Right? And in China today, I think the same thing is true. There's, on one hand, there are people who believe strongly in international collaboration and globalization. And they have a strong position within the government, which says, let's make sure our students go abroad and study. Right? We have hundreds of thousands of Chinese students in the United States. There are tens of thousands of Chinese students, perhaps hundreds of thousands in Europe, fewer in South America. I don't know how many Chinese students are studying in Iran today. So there is that view that says we must be open to the world, our students must go abroad and learn, our professors should spend time studying abroad as well, that we must internationalize. But there's another view in China that also comes from the past, saying, no, we don't want to learn about the outside world. Outside world is a threat, right? It can undermine our leadership, undermine our government, right? So we see this, I think, not only at the level of the outside world, where the influence of Western theory and ideas about liberalism and democracy are seen as threats to China, but it also exists within China. So national minorities, right, are also seen as threats to China. And the most important example we all know is the Muslim minority in Xinjiang, right, which is seen as an active threat to Chinese unity, right? So I think we have to recognize that in China, there are always two sides to every question. Right? And the collaboration and openness to the world is a dominant position, but there are also voices that want to reject influences from outside.
Thank you so much, Professor Peter Bull, for expansion of your words about two different perspectives of Chinese views about outside world. Dr. Hoseini Moghadam, as for another question, I'd like to ask you is, I suppose this question is somehow overlaps with what Professor Peter Bull explained now. The question is China concerned about the influence of Western norms or humanities in China's universities? That is to say, is Western humanities a threat to undermine Chinese independence? Somehow
I learned from Peter that I can say yes and no to these questions. If from no point of view, if you look at the growing of Western humanities in Chinese higher education, it is really interesting that we see a trend of growth in terms of joint degree program, in terms of establishing department or courses on Western humanities, philosophy, literature, and the other major related to the Western culture. So there is a great desire for expanding Western humanities to somehow in higher education in China. Maybe this interest is driven in part by a desire to improve the quality and competitiveness of Chinese higher education institute. They need it. And as well as recognition that the study of Western ideas and values is important for engaging with the global community. They need it. They need to be familiar with the other countries' culture, customs, philosophy, and the other discipline which related to humanities. But as Peter mentioned, in recent years, we see that this created some concerns between the Chinese intellectual and politicians, that the development of Western humanities in Chinese university is not actually alongside their cultural identity, their independence. For example, some critics argue that emphasis on Western idea and values is leading to a decline in the study of traditional Chinese culture and value, and that is a threat to China's national identity and cultural heritage. There are also concerns about the influence of Western ideas in Chinese society, particularly in area such as politics and social value. For example, some China officials have called for a greater regulation of Western ideas in Chinese university, arguing that they are pose a threat to their social stability and national security, as Peter mentioned about the Muslim and the other minority which are living in China. So there has been ongoing debate and discussion about confrontation of Chinese culture and values with Western humanities. Some argue China's rise as a global power has led to a challenge to dominance of Western culture and idea, including those even in humanities. But one area of particular concern, as again Peter mentioned, clash between traditional Chinese values such as collectivism and a strong emphasis on social harmony, and Western individualism and emphasis on individual right and freedom. This clash can be seen in debate over issues such as human rights, democracy, freedom of expression. Some critics argue that China emphasizes on Confucianism and traditional cultural value can lead to lack of innovation and creativity in the humanities, as well as actually these values may not be compatible with Western notion of critical thinking and intellectual inquiry. There are others, people that believe China traditional cultural values can offer a unique perspective and approach to humanities that is valuable in its own right for Chinese. Based on this approach, Chinese government, as I talk about the Confucius Institute, they are heavily invested in this regard to use this opportunity to actually design a strong alternative in the global sphere against the Western humanities or Western cultures. Um, from this point of view, China continue even investment in some projects such as One Road, One Belt, which seeks to promote Chinese culture values on the global scale. In this part, I would like to emphasize that China, as I told about the freedom of, that sharing and exchanging the values and the cultural heritage in the global sphere. China is not inactive, actually, agent or actor. China is acting by proactive manner of action. I mean that China try to actually by sharing its rich cultural heritage and promoting unique perspective on humanities, enhance its influence on the world stage and shape global discourse on some actual on the subjects such as humanities, such as development, and the other issues which are concerning humanities.
Thank you so much.
Could I make a
Yes, please.
comment on this? I think that, this is very simplistic, but if one of the ways of thinking about differences, cultural differences, to say that Mediterranean civilization has tended to emphasize rights and Chinese civilization has tended to emphasize responsibilities. Okay? So I think there's some truth to that. But on the other hand, when we talk about Western culture, yes, I think in contemporary Western Europe, the United States, there's a strong emphasis on rights, on individual rights, less on individual responsibility, less on collectivity. But if we think about Western intellectual history over the last 2,000 years, it's not one thing, right? I think it would be dangerous for us to emphasize too much the notion that the West is one thing and somehow opposite China, even though there are ways in which we can make that argument that, rights versus responsibilities is an example of that I more or less agree with, right? But Western Chinese culture is not uniform. And so-called Western culture is not uniform either, in present or past. Just think about the divisions that exist between, if we just take a broad view of Mediterranean civilization, right? If we think about the differences that exist between left and right, in politics, the left is much more collectivist, right? And the right is much more individualistic. If we think about divisions within the Muslim world, right? Deep divisions that lead to all sorts of problems. If we think about the history of Western Europe over the last 100 years, two world wars begin in Western Europe, right? So history is a complicated thing.
Thank you, Peter, for actually sharing this idea about two division, and there is no unique form, not only for China, even for Western, that would say that there is actually a worldview based on their original cultures or values. They had to actually share, and in the global atmosphere, because of the globalization, even in Iran, we can say that we have all of values based on our culture and heritage. They are mix of different parts from Eastern countries to Western countries. Thank you for correcting me.
You're muted still, Leila.
Thank you, both professors. If we go ahead for another question, Professor Peter Ball, do you think if China can launch a new movement against modernism through reconstructing and updating the historical traditions of the East?
So I think that the Communist Party of China would say, it does say, that it is scientific, it is modern, it is democratic, and China has a rich tradition and a great and glorious history as an important global power. But it's certainly not, I think, presenting itself as an enemy of modernism. I think it does see itself as an opponent of the hegemony of the United States in world politics, no question about it. I think it's a very strong opponent of that. But its allies in opposing the hegemony of the United States are not terribly good allies. I do not think anyone sees Russia as a model for what it wants to become. Right? Whereas China could actually make an argument that it can be a model. I think it's important to keep in mind that there's one tradition of China, it's a political tradition, which has remained constant even as the ideology of government changed from Confucian to communist. And that is that China, for the last 2,000 years, has been a centralized bureaucratic system. In fact, for the last 2,021 years at least, or 20 or 40 years, beginning with the unification of the warring states in 221 BC, the political model China adopted, and that proved enormously effective, was a centralized bureaucratic system. And what that meant was that local officials were not selected locally, they were sent out from the center. The subordinate officials, the clerks and helpers, things like that, were local. But the officials who led the administrative districts, the counties and the prefectures and the provinces, were all sent from the center for short terms, 2-3 years. And their careers depended upon pleasing the court at the center. There is no place for democracy in that. The only kind of democracy is sort of centralized bureaucratic centralism or democratic centralism, right? But it's a top-down system, right? It depends, however, on merit, so that a centralized bureaucratic system can be successful when it has a shared standard of meritocracy. In early China, meritocracy was often based on family background. A good family meant you had merit. For the last 1,000 years, meritocracy has been based on education. But it is a centralized bureaucratic system. And that has remained constant. I don't think that's going to change. I don't believe that Western liberal democracy is necessarily what it means to be modern. I think there are many ways of being modern. The Chinese have their way, and I think it will not become a Western liberal democracy. I think the centralized bureaucratic system has proved effective for China and will continue. However, there's an argument against my position, which says Taiwan is Chinese, right? But it shows that you can become a democratic system with local elections and choice of local officials by the people. So it's not impossible that China could change the political system it's maintained for the last 2,000 years. But so far, it has not. I don't know what you think of that, Mohammed. You're muted.
No, I'm.
Yeah, Peter, actually, I myself believe that China is a great model for modernization for my country, because during the past 3 decades or 4 decades after the revolution in Iran, we can see some similarities between Iranian experience for development, for designing the future, for dreaming about the future, and Chinese. For example, we see that in China, Cultural Revolution actually enforced a lot of costs to Chinese nations, to Chinese government, country. Many people have been died from in this actually dreaming about the future. I myself believe that for my country, which historically has a top-down hierarchy, which historically couldn't make a decision-making based on intersubjective and participatory manner, we can learn a lot from China, because one of interesting point which I myself learned from researching about Chinese experience, they try to make common sense in decision making. Maybe the decision's effect was wrong or was not in the good of the society and benefit of the society, but the method was a right procedure. I mean that the participatory, different agents from communist parties from local level of analysis to national level of analysis, they participate, they try to share their ideas and took decision based on information and data. And we can learn from China as a model that I remember a famous sentence from Deng Xiaoping: the cat took the mouse.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, it's black or it's white. It's kind of practitioner orientation can solve very usual and common problems and crises in our country, you know. I myself believe that we have a great civilization heritage, and we can use it in a manner of to benefit of our society and of our nation. In this regard, I believe that China experience in governance, in handling the affairs of the people, in limiting the poverty in a very very unbelievable rate in comparing to other countries in the world. So all of this achievement in China are great inspiration for me as a researcher that we can use. We have a lot of shared roots historically. I mean, we can use this experience to have a better governance and have a better development and have a better situation in the new global system.
I think that's an important point, that that for some countries, Chinese experience is filled with very, very valuable lessons, and that has to be respected.
Thank you, Dr. Hosseini. Actually, I was going to ask you about the ways that Chinese intellectual and cultural discourse can affect Iran, and as both countries as the cradles of civilizations can can share, and the way that Iran can build scientific and technological interactions and synergy with China. I suppose you answered this question. If you have some more, please add.
Based on my expertise on future studies, I want to actually focus on some points which I mentioned in the beginning of my speech in this meeting. First of all, we need to have a common sense about the future orientation of our country. This is a great lesson which we can learn from China. I think to somehow we'll lose the orientation, there is no common sense. At least I can assure that there is no common sense between people or politicians about the future dream, the future orientation of our country and our development procedure. And the other things that will be helpful to learn from China discourse is, as I mentioned, about the practitioner orientation in policy making and decision making. We have a lot of problem right now in terms of employment, in terms of productivity, in terms of access into global market, and examples like that. We can from this practitioner orientation, we can learn from China how could we facilitate our actual problem with the other countries, with the other agent in the global, new global system, I mean. And in terms of science and technology, I think as you look at the statistic in scientific publication of Iranian researchers and scientists, you can see that we have already captured good position in the global science development index. I mean that. It means that we can share with our counterparts in China in some disciplines. For example, basic science, mathematics, for example, in Iran has a great, strong, actually, we have a strong department. They have a high H-index citation scientists who can write, who can contribute in the global scientific community easily in terms of their expertise. So we can share, we can define a different joint program. And we have already have a national agreement, bilateral agreement with China in different projects. For example, in One Belt, One Road, we have an agreement with China. We have a strategic agreement with China for next 5 decades. So we can use them and practicize them in science and technology very well. We can learn from China in terms of artificial intelligence, as we know that the future world will be an atmosphere on artificial intelligence. And as Kai fully mentioned in his book, Superpower in Artificial Intelligence, China will one of the great superpower in this regard. We can learn from China. We can define some exchange programs, some research and education program. And simultaneously, we can share with Chinese scientific community in different areas which we have common historical roots in terms of art, in terms of philosophy, in terms of science. We can share with them and actually define a joint program together between Iranian and Chinese scientific community. Furthermore, China and Iran could collaborate on issues related to environment protection. The environment issue are one of the great problem in Iran and in China too. China have experienced a good result in this regard in terms of sustainable development. We can learn from them. And even there is some shared concern about preservation of national resources and need of sustainable growth, which can be considered as a joint criteria for collaboration between Iranian and Chinese scientific community. At the end, I would like to mention that two countries could also work together to promote greater cultural understanding and exchange between East and West. I mean that helping to bridge gap between different civilizations and promote greater global harmony and cooperation. In recent days, we see that China is playing a great role in Middle East by facilitating solving the tension between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And after this experience, Macron took a trip to China and asked China to have a same role in Ukraine issue. So it means that we can define a good opportunity to extend and expanding the bilateral and maybe multilateral in projects some as One Belt, One Road, cooperation and collaboration between Iran and the other countries through China.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hosseini. You mentioned mainly about the ways that we can learn from China, along with the bilateral relations between Iran and China, whether in the areas of science, technology, and economic. You also highlighted the ways that China can play roles in bridging the gap between Iran and West. Dr. Bull, do you have any comments on words of Dr. Hosseini?
Well, I think it's very interesting in the way in which one can use China and its development as a way of reflecting on one's own country's situation. And he's done that very effectively.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Sounds that today's discussion and the questions which I had planned to ask are over. In case the guests or the guests have any more questions, more comments, please, they're all welcome.
During this time that our audience wants to participate, I would like to ask Peter, I want to know that is it possible to actually have another scientific meetings about China and new world system? I mean that because you are a great seniologist in the world, and I would like to ask to actually me as a faculty member of Foresight Department would like to know if it is possible. We would like to have another meeting in this regard, and by emphasizing on very specific issue in future.
Well, it of course depends upon the issues, but my sense would be that the kinds of concerns which you've articulated so well, probably that there are people who work on contemporary China, its international position, its current policies on education, science, and technology, who would be much better equipped to speak to that than I am, because my work really is in the Chinese past and intellectual history. I am, the relations between China and the United States today are not ideal, right? They're even just not as bad as relations between the United States and Iran, but they're not good. And so one of my jobs, I think, as somebody who studies Chinese history, is to try to find ways of helping Americans, in particular, learn about China so that they gain a more nuanced and sophisticated view of China and why China is such an important country. That's so my job is not so much to see China as a source of models for the US as to try to help the US understand why China can be a model for others, and why China can and will be important in the world, right? And to help people think more carefully about how do we relate. How should relations with China develop over time in a way that shows respect for other countries rather than thinking only of our own country as the only model for others?
Thank you, Professor Peter Bull. So in conclusion, we can say that China has led the world, has been one of the magnificent civilizations in the world, and it has the potential to lead. It is not the model in the world, but still it has the potential to be the model, and maybe it has the potential to change the world system. It was what I could summarize just in some 2 sentences what I learned tonight. If there is any more words, Dr. Hosseini.
No, thank you, Ms. Khadem. I really learned from Peter in this meeting.
Me too. It was really an honor.
Yeah. As he said, that United States is a great stakeholder in the international system. It is a reality. And even between Iran and China can help to actually, if a Chinese partner wants to collaborate with us, they need to have a green card of the United States counterpart. So I hope in the future meeting, we could think about the believable solution for expanding Chinese, Iran and the United States cooperation and collaboration together for future. Thank you, Ms. Khadem.
Not at all. And as expertise in the field of futurology, you planned what we are going to discuss in our next forum about the ways that China and Iran can expand their relations in the future, and the way that it can facilitate Iran and U.S. maybe relations or other countries. Thank you. It was my honor and pleasure to be here with you. I really learned. It was very informative, and thank you so much, Dr. Peterbull. Wishing you a nice weekend, and Dr. Hoseini Moghadam, wishing you a good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you very much, Ms. Khadem.
Thank you. Have a good.
Bye-bye.
Have a good. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Goodbye.